This video is on Unit 1, Learning Targets 1 through 5. This will be our first unit of the year. And so in order to establish some beginning information, we have to talk about what we're talking about this year. And part of that is science as a whole. What is science? Science is just a body of knowledge gathered together. The word science means knowledge. It's gathered together throughout the years, and it's specifically concerning the natural world. So we're not talking about ghosts and Bigfoot and mermaids. We're talking about the natural world, things that actually exist on Earth. It's gathered through, this information and knowledge is gathered through observation and experimentation. And this knowledge is organized into different branches of science. And we will be concerning ourselves with one of them, biology. Biology is the study of life. You see here this picture, lots of different kinds of life happening. And you have some different rainforest creatures here. Well, with biology, we not only study rainforest creatures, but we study bacteria, we study plants, we study genetics, we study biochemistry. We will be looking at lots of things, all of it pertaining to life. Now, in order to do biology or any other science, we have to practice something called the scientific method. Now, it's going to seem rather linear, meaning kind of a step-by-step process. Sometimes science happens that way, sometimes it doesn't. But we're going to learn it in a linear fashion in order to just help us process it better. And so take this model airplane here. I used to build models when I was a kid. Not very good at it because I don't like to follow directions and I don't like to be told how I should do something. And so when I would open a box like this, I would just start building things. Then I would look at the picture and I'd think, oh, that looks cool. And I would start putting things together. And lo and behold, I would have about 60 extra pieces and mine would look nothing like the one in the box. Why? Because I didn't follow directions. So with the scientific method, there's a particular order that we're going to go in as we go throughout this class. And as we get more comfortable with it, it may make sense to diverge from that some. So how does the scientific method start? It starts with observations. Observations are the very first part of the scientific method. What is an observation? An observation is just information that we can gather using our five senses. What are our five senses? Well, you learn these in elementary school. Seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting. And this is how our body gathers information from the world, sends it to our brain so that our brain can do something with it. Well, we see here in this picture, for instance, what do we see? Well, we see bears. We see bears fishing. That's what bears do. Well, why are they standing next to the waterfall? Well, I just asked a question. Think we could answer that question using science? Sure. Why are they standing together? Maybe it's the best place to catch them. Why are the fish jumping up the waterfall? There's lots of questions that we could ask about this picture just based on the observation that we've seen. And so naturally following observations are things like questions. Observation, I saw bears eating fish at a small waterfall. Question, why do bears go there to eat fish? Observation, I was in the woods one day and I ate some berries. They tasted like burning. Question, why did those berries taste like burning? Well, we could do a experiment or something like that to solve that. Well, what do we need next? We need something called a hypothesis. Well, what is a hypothesis? Hypothesis is a possible explanation for a set of observations, a possible answer to a scientific question. You have heard it said that the hypothesis is a guess. That's fine, but it's not just a random guess about a random thing. It's actually a guess concerning the question that we have based on our observations. So I observe in this picture a bear going after a tent. Why is that bear going after the tent? That's a natural question. Well, maybe my hypothesis would be, I think that bears go to the tents that have food in them. Could we test that out using science? Absolutely. We could make an experiment. We could test my hypothesis and see if it is valid or not. Now, that brings us to the next thing. That is an experiment. Now, an experiment tests the validity of a hypothesis. It is a test or a series of tests that determines the effect of a single variable. One variable is measured in an experiment. If you're measuring more than one variable, you can't determine which variable is causing the change. And so you have to measure one variable at a time, one variable per experiment. What is a variable? These are things that are changed or that you change. So we're going to look at those. Two kinds of variables. There are the independent and the dependent variable. Well, three kinds. These are the kinds that we're going to be. The third is called the control variable. But the dependent and the independent variable, things that we actually track using a graph. And you can see here the independent variable is always tracked on the x-axis and the dependent variable is always tracked on the y-axis. Why is that? Well, the dependent variable is what we call the responding variable. Why? Because it responds to the independent variable. It is the variable that we actually measure. So if we were going to, let's say in our experiment about bears and tents, perhaps we put 10 tents with food and 10 without food or whatever. And so our dependent variable would be the food in the tent. It's the thing that we're actually changing. Or no, the independent variable would be the food, the thing that we're actually changing. The dependent variable, the things that we're measuring is how many bears go to a tent with food versus how many bears go to a tent without food. And so we would put our independent variable at the bottom. What is an independent variable? This is the variable that we manipulate. This is the manipulated variable that is changed or manipulated during the experiment. We can manipulate the number of tents that have food versus the number of tents that don't have food. If we wanted to see how fast a plant grows over the course of 5 days, the time would be the independent variable because we are controlling the amount of time we're watching. The dependent variable will be the amount that the plant grows. This is what we're actually measuring. So ask yourself what is being measured, and that is the dependent variable. It's tracked on the y-axis. All right, there's also the control group. All right, and the control group is the group that you use to measure the other groups against. So back to our bear experiment, the control group would be the tent without food in it. If we just put a lot of tents with food, we wouldn't be able to tell whether or not that actually made a change. Well, if five of the tents with food were attacked and 5 of the tents without food were attacked, we could reasonably say maybe the food isn't the thing. Well, if all 10 tents with food were attacked and none of them without food were attacked, then we have a possible solution to our problem. And so the control group is what you use to measure the other group against. It's like a comparison. Now, there are other factors in an experiment that we would also call control variables. In our bear experiment, we would use the same kind of bear. We would use the same kind of food, the same kinds of tents. All of these things would be very similar so that we know that it's the one thing that we changed, food or not food, that is actually affecting the experiment. Now, what do? We gather data. Well, I was giving some examples of data. Well, 5 bears, there were 5 of the tents that had food that were attacked. None of the tents without food were attacked. That is data. Data is just information that is gathered from an experiment. There are 2 kinds of data that we're going to look at in this class: qualitative data and quantitative data. So for qualitative data, well, here's a bear, and this is a sick-looking bear. Well, qualitative data is data that cannot be measured. It's not going to be a number. So when I look at this bear, there are some certain qualitative measurements, or not measurements, but qualitative observations that I can make and I can gather data from. This bear is white. This bear is skinny. This bear has a hole in its head. This bear looks hungry or looks sick. These are all things that you can't measure. Well, someone's like, well, Mr. Chipman, you can measure skinny. No, you can't. You can measure waist circumference. You can weigh the bear and get its weight. But skinny is not a measurable thing. It's a subjective term. What's skinny to one person is not skinny to the next. And so this is qualitative data. Quantitative data is always a number. Quantitative data is always a number. The bear weighs 200 pounds. Bears normally weigh 360 pounds. I don't know. Here's some quantitative data. What can you normally do with quantitative data? You can normally put it in a graph. Here's the status of polar bear populations in the world. 45% are stable, 14% increasing, and so forth. This is data that can be measured. These are based on numbers, not the bear looked good and the other bears didn't, or something like that. Now, with data by itself doesn't say very much, but we can interpret data. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look at a sentence that's in a foreign language, you have to interpret it into a language you understand first in order to get it. And so it's the same thing. When you look at this graph, this is home runs per game over the course of years, years being the independent variable, home runs per game being the dependent variable in this experiment. What can you tell about the rate at which home runs have increased? Well, they go up. They go up to here and then all of a sudden shoot up and then kind of do this and then shoot up again. Well, what's going on here? We can interpret this data. It means something. Well, what's happening around here? This is the beginning of the live ball era. What's happening around here? Well, steroids. More home runs are going to be hit. And so we can interpret that data based on things that we know. And so you could look at a graph like this, and you could interpret that data to say, well, perhaps 45 are stable and 16 are decreasing, and maybe this is a cause of global warming or something like that, and you can interpret that data. And so this is a little bit more subjective. For instance, scientists walking out in the tundra, they find this bear. Looks like a bear costume that somebody jumped out of. Well, it's actually a real bear that's laying there. Well, we could make several qualitative judgments on this bear. Skinny, it's dead. It's relatively clean. Doesn't look like it's been dead long. We could make several quantitative judgments. It weighs 100 pounds. It's 14 feet long, yada, yada, yada. We could interpret that data to say, well, bears are normally, a full-grown polar bear normally weighs 900 pounds. This bear weighed 100 pounds when it died. Something's wrong with this bear. Well, why is the bear in the tundra without snow? Why isn't it in the snow? So there's all these things that we could interpret, and we could say, well, perhaps this is a result of global warming or something like that. The people who took this picture, that was their assumption. Now, that leads us to inference. What is inference? Well, inference is logical conclusions based on prior knowledge and experiments. So an inference can lead to a hypothesis, can lead to experimentation. You look at this picture, this dude is obviously fallen, or at least that's what I'm inferring, because I've seen people fall off bikes before. I've seen people hit the ground like this before, and this is what it typically looks like. However, this guy could have completely staged this picture. I could do more research and find out what happened. All right, so I can infer based on what I know, based on what I know about people under bikes in the rain that have this grimace on their face, that he's probably fallen. All right, that he's probably had an accident on his bike. Back to the berries in the woods. Last time I ate those berries, it tastes like burning. Similar kinds of berries are likely to burn as well. That is an inference. In science, we use inference a lot in order to make further judgments, in order to make further hypotheses.